Welcome to the Control the Room podcast, a series devoted to the exploration of meeting culture and uncovering cures for the common meeting. Some meetings have tight control, and others are loose. To control the room means achieving outcomes while striking a balance between imposing and removing structure, asserting and distributing power, leaning in and leaning out, all in the service of having a truly magical meeting. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to join us live for a session sometime, you can join our weekly Control the Room Facilitation Lab. It's a free event to meet fellow facilitators and explore new techniques, so you can apply the things you learn in the podcast in real time with other facilitators. Sign up today at voltagecontrol.com/facilitation-lab. If you'd like to learn more about my new book, Magical Meetings, you can download the Magical Meetings Quick Start Guide, a free PDF reference with some of the most important pieces of advice from the book. Download a copy today at voltagecontrol.com/magical-meetings-quick-guide. Today, I'm with Tim Beattie, Global Head of Product and a Senior Principal for Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, where he unleashes the power of open processes and technology working together. He is also the author of the book, DevOps Culture and Practice with OpenShift. Welcome to the show, Tim.
Thanks, Doug. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking forward to the conversation. So let's get started with just a little bit of background on how you found your way into this work around, unleashing open processes and helping people collaborate.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a journey for me. It's been a real evolution. I have worked the last couple of decades in the world of systems integration and project delivery, working in professional services organizations, and over the years, working with many different clients, many different projects. I've worked with so many teams. Many teams have been awesome. Some teams have been really impeded and held back. And about 15 years ago, I was working for a huge systems integrator, and I was working on huge program of work, hundreds of people, multi-year program. And I personally felt quite a lot of frustration about the speed that we were able to deliver to customers, to end users. I felt the whole approach to delivering software in this case, there had to be a quicker way, a better way. I mean, we were literally going year after year without delivering anything, just lots of documentation and lots of process and things that were holding teams back. And for me, then I thought, look, this is just too big. I need to go and work on small stuff, small projects, small teams, and maybe I will get more of a buzz and not have so much frustration. I moved to a boutique consultancy. I stumbled upon a number of practices that I just loved. Some of them were, I learned later, were agile. I didn't know they were agile at the time, but they just, it made a lot of sense. It was very pragmatic. There was an awful lot more talking directly to customers, releasing more often to customers, getting feedback from customers. There was just a lot more communication and collaboration. And I loved it. And seeing the satisfaction all round within the teams I was working in and with the customers I was working with, it just felt like a breath of fresh air. And so I enjoyed the next 10 years learning more about agile and lean and design thinking and all of these frameworks as I started to realize this is what really ignites my passion in IT. It's this collaboration. And then the icing on the cake was about 4.5 years ago. Again, in my effort to continuously improve and adapt what I do with my career, the one sticking point I had with the kind of services I was delivering was the teams I was working with all belonged to my supply side organization. So we were project teams, and typically a project would run for 6 to 9 months. The team were awesome because we were using all of that collaboration and there was amazing energy. But my frustration then was, when this project runs out of funding, those people scatter in different directions. And just at the point of awesomeness, the team disappears. And I think, what a shame. And I felt this was a little bit almost dishonest around agility. I felt, Agile is all about long-lived product teams and, keeping the team together. So I got an opportunity to come and work with Red Hat. At that time, I thought Red Hat, techie company. I wasn't sure if I was the right fit, but the part of Red Hat that was launching them was called Open Innovation Labs. And it was all about seeding long-lived customer product teams within the customer's organization. And the main product that I look after as the head of product for Red Hat Open Innovation Labs is called the Residency. And it's all about enabling teams to use practices, to use Red Hat's culture, which is based on open source, and the technology to be a long-lived team within that organization. And this felt like a great way to deliver great agile. And that's where I am now. So in the last few years, I've learned more and more about open organizations and open source. So I think, over the last 15 years, it just brought me down this evolution into where I can just work with some great practices, with some great teams and great people, and create an infectious enthusiasm of energy within the teams that I work with.
It's interesting to hear you talk about finding that open innovation group there at Red Hat, and also just this issue you bumped into around the short-lived nature and how the team kind of spreads like a dandelion, and then all the value kind of evaporates. The momentum's lost. And I had the pleasure of meeting Jim Coulson from IBM, who spoke at the CTO conference here in Austin and has collaborated with me on some local meetups and things, and as well as Chris Watts, who I think spent some time at Red Hat as well, and maybe might be back at IBM now. And they were both telling me about the innovation approach at IBM, which I think Red Hat kind of was doing also independently before any of the IBM stuff, which is really fascinating, because the way I understand it is that there's a group that's sitting in between R&D and product who is basically creating points of view and kind of harvesting stuff from R&D and then packaging it up and then working with product to bring that to light and helping provide resources that can make these projects really kind of stand up. And it really dawned on me that how powerful this is, this notion is this liaison group who's not necessarily quite a bit different than what we see in a lot of companies that create innovation groups, where it's like, oh, these are the people that get to go have the fancy coffee bars and stuff, versus enabling the rest of the org to maybe notice these things and then, bring them to life within the org, within the normal value stream.
What you say reminds me of one of the really cool things I like about our Open Innovation Labs is, Red Hat has its own products. We are a software product company. When our customers come into our lab space, one of the things we want to do is give them access to Red Hat, as much as Red Hat as they're interested in. And I think when I look at our product engineers who are developing our products, one of the best things we can do is put them side by side with our customers who are consuming and using their products. And it's a win-win situation. It means our customers get access to those product engineers. They start to learn about, what roadmap looks like, and maybe some awesome new features coming their way. But also it means our product engineers get access to the people who are adopting their software. And often that empathy doesn't exist in product. And this is where real innovation happens, when we can have that kind of level of feedback loops between the people who are using value, using features, and the people who are delivering that. And I'm seeing that happen more and more, where we're breaking down those silos so that we can provide that direct access. And some of the conversations and the learning that happens when you can create that space in a lab environment and those conversations to happen is just enormously powerful, and what really sets the way for great outcomes for both sides, really.
Yeah, it also reminds me of this phenomenon where, a lot of companies create these silos of research. They've got the UX team that's out there doing the research, and without the research happening at the team level, it's hard for them to have that feedback loop, right? So it's like if the developers are having to rely on research that someone else did, especially if it's down the hall or in another building, in another city or state or whatever, it's a lot different, right? Than if it's on your team and it's like a daily or weekly conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's lots of different tools that can help with that. Like you say, having this stuff happen in a closed room in a different part of the business park, it's a world's difference to an open space where we invite stakeholders or anyone who's interested in what this team are innovating on to come in. And we have a term called walk the walls. You literally walk the walls with someone, and you have a good old-fashioned conversation about all of the visualization on those walls, all of the information being radiated on those walls, and being able to use that kind of transparent way of working that allows you to see what teams are doing, why they're doing it, how they're pivoting, what they're learning, what their product increment looks like, and inviting conversation and feedback. So having that visualization and inviting, those conversations is really helpful. Likewise, having things like, regular showcase events, whether they be demos or sprint reviews or just short sessions to be able to show off something that we're trying out, because at that point the learning is quite minimal. It's when we start to share the work that we're doing and do it in an environment where inviting conversation and feedback, that's what generates great products. Having other ways of getting your work out there, written showcases, project postcards, sketch note visualizations. There's tons of tools I think that teams can use to just share with the world, show the world the greatness that they are trying and experimenting with, and get those conversations flowing and get those feedback loops activated at many, many different levels.
Yeah, it kind of echoes one of the mantras that we believe strongly in, and this notion that what gets visualized gets velocity.
Yeah, like that.
And when you talk about walking the walls, they're seeing the visuals, they're kind of peering into the future a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, yeah. I mean, the number of ideas, some of the best ideas for the future come up either during a walk the wall session in the conversations or a retrospective event where you're just taking that time to, as a team, reflect on, great stuff that we've done and we want to do more of, but, what would make us that little bit better? And I think back to just some of the most amazing, simple ideas that have come out from just, enabling that culture of conversation and collaboration and ideation to come to life.
So I wanted to come back to one of the things you said in your description of your background and how you got started. And you talked about systems integration. And it kind of piqued my interest because I started thinking about systems thinking. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how much that background and kind of viewing the world through that lens has impacted your thinking around collaboration and about how teams and people come together to work.
Yeah, I mean, that has been a real evolution in my thinking throughout my career. I think back to some of the big programs of work where big systems integration projects where different system teams operated very independently in a silo. So you may have you may be working for a telecoms company, and you would have a billing team, and you would have a provisioning team, and you would have a customer care team, and so on, and maybe an integration team who are completely separate. And when we're doing big systems development projects, these huge teams, sometimes 60, 70, 80 people in each of these teams, would never really collaborate. They would each deliver their own bit of the solution. And, some months later, we would try and plug them all together and see if they talk to each other. And, 99.9% of the time they didn't, because, we hadn't worked together. We hadn't designed together. We hadn't released together and integrated early together. And, to me at the time, I was relatively junior, and I didn't think there was any other way. This is the way big systems are delivered. And it's always painful when you try to do integration testing. Similarly, when you eventually go live, these big programs, finally go into production several years later, they get handed off into a whole separate part of the organization that look after the operations. We've never met the people who were going to maintain or support or fix problems in these systems. They were all handed over through documents. And again, I didn't know any other way. This to me, that was just a way. Now, I think over the years, as I've learned more and more techniques and frameworks and seen more and more examples of great ways of working, I've learned about things like systems thinking, and you start to realize the impact, the causal effects of not having that collaboration. And when you can break down those silos and start to create a more cross-functional, horizontal team, that stretches through, almost turn the organization on its side to deliver much more frequently, you really start to see the impact of it. So it's almost like I've come through that evolution from seeing how slow we can go by bringing down those barriers, by bringing down those silos, by speeding up that collaboration and sharing and that transparency. We can really see the impact and the effect that has in terms of the quality of releases, the frequency of releases, and the time it takes to deliver new ideas to end users.
One thing that comes to mind is a common thing that we hear around, oh, we don't have time for that.
Yeah.
Whether it's like, talking to customers or bringing the team together for an exploration session where we might generate better understanding, better alignment, because they feel like they, to use your language earlier, in the pre-show chat, you were talking about outcomes versus outputs, and they're kind of in that output mode, and they're just like banging out features, but they're not, maybe it's the conversation around outputs versus outcomes, but what's your go-to to help teams understand that, we might have to slow down in order to speed up overall?
Yeah, it's funny because I think in this world of agile and scrum and frameworks that have come to become more and more popular over recent years, what we're hearing teams talk about is, velocity and story points and, time to value and, how many features they can deliver. And what we've ended up with is a world where we can deliver more features faster, but it's still all outputs. It's all about, how many features are those features actually being used? Are they generating outcomes to stakeholders or users or the people that matter? Are they delivering outcomes that matter? One of the stories I love to tell is about my grandmother who lived in the north of Ireland, where I'm from. And I remember about 15 years ago, she was very frustrated with the TV remote control. She had this huge remote control for a TV, and it must have had about 40 or 50 buttons on it, and it looked terrifying. And all she wanted to do was switch the TV on or off, turn the volume up or down and change the channel. But somehow or other, there were 40 or 50 buttons on this remote control. And I thought this is a classic example of where we've over-engineered and the team have just focused on churning out as many possible functions or features as they possibly can. And the chances are, 80, 90% of them will never be used. What I actually ended up doing was putting black tape over all of the buttons she didn't use. So she ended up with a 6-button remote control, which is all she needed, to deliver the outcomes that mattered to her. And I think that's what more and more organizations need to learn to do. They need to figure out, what are the actual outcomes that are going to matter to our customers? What are the measurable impacts that we want to affect on the people using our systems, and how can we work in a much more experimental approach so we can learn faster as to how we can deliver those outcomes that matter quicker through experiments. So I use stories like that to sort of tee up the conversation, but really I think our approach is, let's start with one team. Let's not try and get hundreds of people thinking differently, overnight. Let's see if we can use some practices with one team, one application, one use case, working a different way that's more outcome driven. And let's see if we can, first of all, create the buzz and the infectious enthusiasm within that team to work that way, but also some mind-blowing metrics around the ability to deliver features through a shorter lead time or through a higher frequency of deployments or through a shorter amount of time to fix issues on production platforms and things like that. Because I think if we can do that with one team and break down the barriers and the impediments that prevented them from doing that, then we can open the door and say, well, how do we get more teams working like this one? How do we create that infectious enthusiasm across the organization and scale this to more and more teams?
The way I like to refer to that is the internal case study. Like often people talk about, oh, this worked at Google or this worked at Facebook or wherever. And it's like, or even at Red Hat. And it's like, well, we're not any of those companies,
No.
And it's so easy to explain away how we're different. And so carving out a case study.
And we can't expect people to copy. It's like the number of people that, want to apply the Spotify model because they hear about, what Spotify did. But, you've got to create, your organization's own culture, your own way, which you've got to go through that evolution yourselves. So this is what really, motivated me around our residency model, because we were really focusing on giving a team within an organization that experience. So they kind of had that internal case study themselves, but something that they could then use as a seed to then, enable, educate, inspire others to create their own kind of stories as well and grow those internal case studies into a portfolio of case studies, really.
Yeah, the Spotify example is pretty interesting. And for those of you that aren't familiar, Spotify released a blog post saying, here's how we run our product development organization, really focused on the development end of things and how they organize people into squads and
Mm.
there are kind of delivery units. And then there's like guilds and things that might be more topical or more functionally driven. But the fascinating thing about it that I think is really interesting, and I'd love to hear your thoughts here, is that when I talk to folks that are at Spotify or familiar with them, they talk about how we don't really do that anymore. We kind of evolved past that. So if you really want to apply the Spotify model, then you should be taking an experimentation approach,
Yeah.
and you should be looking inwardly at our culture and not just thinking, oh, DevOps is Jenkins or Docker or whatever, or continuous deployment. Sure, those are best practices, but like, how do we improve our culture? How do we make our people more effective? How do we focus on that developer experience?
Yeah.
And I think your book really focuses on this trinity of people, process, and technology. So how do we help people collaborate together, and what's the processes we might use and borrow from? And I think that's really fascinating. It really gets to that ethos of focusing on the developer experience rather than saying, here's this roadmap for like how to automate our deployment or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think the book. One of the things we really tried to focus when we wrote the book was not to make it about technology. So it is a book about DevOps. People think DevOps is a techie thing. To me, it's a collaboration philosophy. It's an ideology that is all about bringing down silos and getting communication flows working through an organization. Starting with dev and ops, that's where the name came from, but really extending beyond that and thinking about everyone involved in the value chain, including end users, including some of the stakeholders like security and operational people. And I think to achieve great DevOps requires an adaptive approach. It's you can't go to the Spotify website or go to Spotify and ask for a copy of their business model and then do copy paste and say, there we go, we are now like Spotify. It's something that needs to emerge, and it's something that will involve a lot of learning along the way. And the book, we've divided it into a number of sections. So first of all, we talk about the importance of building a foundation. And that foundation is all around culture and collaboration and putting the platform in place to provide the technology, because there are some great, accelerators we can get from the technology. But a large focus on it is really about the people and the cultural practices that enable the people to operate with increased psychological safety, with an increased level of energy and enthusiasm and autonomy. And we talk about autonomy, mastery, purpose a lot in this, to kind of create that foundation that our teams can then work on top of. And then the next part of the books talk about, the importance of continuous discovery and continuous delivery. And this is really, and we have a section all about the different practices, and most of them are really collaboration practices that help us discover our why. Why are we here? What problems are we trying to solve? Who are we trying to solve them for? And what are the target measurable outcomes we're trying to achieve? Then we have a section about, well, how do you then decompose those outcomes into experiments? How do you prioritize those experiments? How can you, in a very modern way of delivering software, how can we use some of the really advanced capabilities to run experiments and learn from our users really, really fast? And then we have a section all about delivery, which is, what are the practices and techniques that allow us to deliver in a much more iterative and incremental way. So those sections, the foundation, discovery, the options and the delivery, we're not even really talking about tech at all in any of those. It's all about the people. It's all about the collaboration and the practices. We do then have some sections about, building it, running it, owning it, which for the techie people, they can get their hands messy, but we also think it's something that the less techie people will learn from. And then finally, we get into sections about, well, once we've been round that loop of discovery and delivery, how do we kind of continuously learn from that, and how do we sustain that cultural foundation, and how do we grow from it? So yeah, a book about DevOps, which is at very most 1/3 about technology. And I would actually say that the real focus, the really interesting part that our many test readers have come back to us as being the stories about collaboration and breaking down the silos, which is what has enabled great DevOps to take place.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to watch the evolution of DevOps, thinking back into the, early days where operations and development were two separate units, and often developers weren't allowed to even have production access.
Yeah.
And, the ops team were the ones that were the experts in how to configure the Sun systems and, and the storage arrays and all this stuff, right? Which required their own programming languages. It really was the shift to commodity hardware that was maybe the first moment that allowed this opening, right? Where, oh wow, maybe we can automate, the difference between a development environment and a production system is starting to diminish, right?
Yeah.
So this notion of having to have someone that's going to be responsible for how the software runs in production versus how it gets coded is, and if you think about it, looking back on it, how just dysfunctional that is, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
You think about operations, sure, you might want to have people that know how to keep the systems running and get alerted and security and these kinds of things. But the software only being responsible to write it, not how it is stable and runs. It's just wow. You're not really talk about the outcomes versus outputs, right?
Yeah.
If you're only responsible for writing it, that is an output task versus making sure it runs and it doesn't fall down. That's a lot more outcome driven.
It is, and it's funny because I think over recent years we've really shifted the focus towards the end user when we're building products. Human-centered design and design thinking and lean UX, and so we now have much greater empathy on users' pain points, and how we can make their lives, their jobs that they do easier, simpler, automated. And I think DevOps is really the next evolution of that. We're thinking, well, these practices work so well for creating that empathy with users. How can we create that same empathy to developers from the people that build, platform and the underlying infrastructure that we're developing on? How about we create the same kind of collaboration and connections between those platform engineers and those developers? How about we put the developer, heart of the experience so that we are continuously learning from them and thinking about how can we remove their pain points? And this idea of taking a product approach, a product mindset to platforms, I think is really an exciting space where we're effectively using what's worked really well in building products over the last decade, and now thinking, well, how can we apply the same principles, the same philosophies, the same ideologies to the underlying infrastructure? And that to me is what is really exciting about DevOps.
Yeah, I think in general, anytime people can apply design thinking, DevOps, lean, agile, any of this kind of more modern approaches to collaboration and just the way we work, if we can point that stuff inward to our teams and redirect it to different audiences, that's when we find real nascent opportunities that aren't necessarily the stuff you're going to read about in the book. You were talking earlier about these discovery moments where we find out something that's unique about ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think, whether it's developer experience or employee experience or the platform team experience, or the more we can get curious about what others are going through and how we can best create ease in their experience, I think we all will appreciate the job more, and the work becomes more fluid. We can hit flow states more easily.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's it flows through the whole organization. Taking that product mindset approach to everything. Continuous discovery, continuous delivery, a foundation of culture. I think dev teams, platform teams, even leadership. I think this mindset of evolution and inspect and adapt, and probing and sensing and responding based on change. We're in a world where change is happening all the time. So at every level in an organization, whether it's an application, whether it's an underlying platform, or whether it's a leadership strategy, having a system of work, a way of thinking that allows us to pivot and adapt when we get feedback, or when we get learning, or when we get measures that are telling us that's the next best thing to do, I think is really, really important. And that's been particularly true in the last 18 months in the world of our pandemic, I think.
What are your thoughts on structure? Specifically, I think about Conway's Law and how our org charts can sometimes limit our ability to create or even develop software systems that can be resilient or can be compatible to this way of thinking, right? There's lots of folks that are managing legacy systems that, it makes it very difficult to do iterative development on. Whereas, you've got folks that are building from scratch, and it's like, it's really easy to add continuous deployment when you're starting from nothing.
Yeah.
You just start with it, right? I often coach people when they're founders and young CTOs and stuff. When they ask me about this stuff, I'm like, put it in place, but don't overcomplicate it. Like even just using Docker, but not trying to like automate everything means that you already are on that foundation.
Yeah.
So you don't have to rip everything out and re-add it later.
Yeah.
But the point is, I'd love to hear your thoughts just on structure in general, structure of the organization, structure on the software. Like how is that impacting people's abilities to lean into this way of thinking, this way of working?
Yeah, I think we talked earlier a little bit about that kind of that first team and that internal case study, and that in some ways that's easy, like you say, that clearing the path for that one team to work in a new way is inspiring and can be easy. But when you want to apply that kind of philosophy to the wider org, you very quickly run into challenges around the way the org is structured. And, you mentioned Conway's law and, the cognitive load that hits people whenever we're having to deal with many different parts of the organization and switch contexts many, many times. That's what really slows us down. The great book, I don't know if you've read it, Team Topologies by Manuel Pais and Matthew Skelton, who we've been working with recently. And this idea of, streamline teams around the product and the business value and having that kind of cross functionality, and the platform teams, giving a platform that enables developers to do their job much better and to kind of allow them to focus on delivering the value in their streamlined teams, and then the enabling teams, coming along, which is kind of the function I see as what we often do. So I think it's an evolution, it's a journey. It's not I don't think it's one of these things that we do a sort of operating model refresh and suddenly just install a whole new operating model. It's something that has to evolve with time as we grow and spread the culture and the ways of working and the practices more towards those streamlined teams, those cross-functional product teams. And I think, finding ways to measure the cognitive load within teams, finding, ways to sort of see where that almost damage is being caused, what that's what's slowing us down, having these handovers, having these silos, having these systems in place where, in order to get something done end to end, you're having to raise tickets on teams and you're having wait times and delays all over the place. I think being able to visualize those kind of identifies where the bottlenecks are within org structures, and that's where that can almost start to create a case for change and a prioritization for changing some of the org structure so that we can break those bottlenecks apart.
Great thoughts. And I really appreciate all of that. And I had to recognize that we're kind of quickly running out of time. And I know that we could easily geek out on this stuff for hours.
We could, yeah.
Taps into my, years of CTO background. And so I don't always get to talk about DevOps with folks, but want to just make sure to give you time to leave our listeners with a final thought. So where can they find the book? How can they learn more, et cetera? Like just maybe just a moment to share.
Yeah, sure. So I'd love to collaborate with anyone who wants to continue this conversation. The book is called DevOps Culture and Practice with OpenShift, which is all about delivering continuous business value through people, process, and technology. It's a book I wrote with Mike Hepburn, Noel O'Connor, Donal Spring, and it was illustrated by Ilaria Doria. We're really excited about this. It's a huge book. It's like a travel guide that you might, you can dip into different parts. If you're interested in culture or discovery or the tech, there's something for everyone in there, but it's also something relevant for everyone. So it's available on Amazon. So you can buy either the hard copy or the Kindle version on Amazon. You'll also be able to download it from Red Hat. So if you Google Red Hat DevOps Culture and Practice with OpenShift, it will take you to our page where you'll be able to get a PDF copy of it. And I'd love feedback. We think DevOps and everything we're talking about is a never done state. It's always evolving. It's always adapting. So yeah, we'd love to hear feedback. My Twitter handle is TDBeattie, so TDBeattie. And yeah, feel free to get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn, and would love to hear any thoughts or ideas people have got about anything that I've written or have said about.
Awesome. Definitely check out the book, y'all, and look up Tim on Twitter. I'm sure you'll be hitting the speaker circuit and getting the book out there. So I'm sure there'll be lots of opportunity to hear more about your philosophies on DevOps, etc. It's really great. Love that this book's out there. And it's been a pleasure chatting today, Tim. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a great chat.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Control the Room. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates when new episodes are released. And if you want more, head over to our blog where I post weekly articles and resources about working better together. voltagecontrol.com.